Well, Rick, uh, you know, can we speak about your story just a little? Because
Sure.
there's one thing is that I get a different sense. You get Cosmos and Psyche, which is a great title, by the way, and a great book. But it's like Hillman influenced me with the Anima Mundi and all of that, and then, but your Cosmos is different feel. I think it comes to maybe some of the things we were just talking about there. But anyway, can we first? Can you tell me, because this is the loose end I've been having here in Australia, how did you actually get from that well-established path on your way to Harvard, going to study at Harvard, and get to Esalen? How did you get involved in all of this stuff? And then hopefully we can maybe talk about between Anima
Sure.
Mundi and Cosmos.
Sure. Happy to do that. I'm happy that we managed to talk about everything else, but
it's a good conversation.
Stan and James are Grof and Hillman are endlessly worth discussing and exploring and understanding. So, but let's finish up here with a few words about my own path. So, I was at Harvard from 1968 to 72, which those years, late 60s, early 70s, were kind of the kind of climax of countercultural energies and ideas and music and film and politics, etc. And so, and of course, every university campus in the world pretty much was a hotbed of that kind of activity, and Cambridge, Massachusetts was certainly one of those. I think right up there with Berkeley. Cambridge and Berkeley were two of the leading places. And of course, the psychedelic revolution had strong origins there at Harvard as well. And I met Ramdas, Richard Alport, who had gone to India and come back as Ramdas. And right when he came back to Cambridge, I met him and was quite influenced by him there, both in terms of the interest in the East, which I already had gotten from Alan Watts or even Erich Fromm. I don't know if you know, like Erich Fromm had some.
I used to have his books when I was 16 or 17.
Yeah, same here. Yeah, so that was a kind of early point of interest, and then Alan Watts is almost like someone that many people like ourselves, I think, found as a kind of important threshold guide. And so that was all in the air at the time. But I was deeply studying both Freud and Jung and depth psychology. Fortunately, Harvard did have a good, real interest in psychoanalysis and in even in Jung, and which you don't find in a lot of university psychology departments. But this was a department that, where Erik Erikson taught, and it was pretty eclectic. And so while there,
just a question, sorry to butt in. Would you see yourself as, were you part of the 60s uprising? Were you just interested, or were you kind of,
No, I was a psychedelic hippie. Yeah, I was, long hair.
It's just that you could continue your studies at the highest. You had both going, basically.
Yeah, there was something in me that was fully committed to, higher education and learning as much as I could. I was just ravenous for knowledge, but also for self-understanding, as every adolescent tends to be. And so, yeah, I was very, very much into the counterculture, and it lived and breathed through me as I was grateful for it in many ways. And so both of those were happening at the same time.
Yeah.
So and Harvard and Cambridge were carrying both of them very strongly at the same time, and it was possible to hold both of those in a kind of tension. And I'll just mention two things that played a role in the shift that you're pointing to here. One is that during my freshman year, their first year at Harvard, in the spring of 1969, there was a two-part series that was published in the Harvard newspaper called the Harvard Crimson, the title of which was "After Harvard, Esalen? ? And I read this article by a Harvard student who had gone out to Esalen and had very powerful experiences. They're not easy, but powerful and transformational. And he wrote about it with such he gave me a sense that I would like to go there after I'm done with Harvard. And then also, while I was there, one of the professors in the Harvard Divinity School, Hans Hofmann, had been trained by Jung as an Jungian analyst, but he was also a theologian, Protestant theologian, et cetera. But during one of our discussions, he said to me, he must have asked me my birth information, and he like one day came in with where my sun and moon and planets were, and I just thought, this is not I'm surprised by astrology coming into our conversation, because he's so sophisticated. We're usually talking about European intellectual history, Freud, Jung, their ideas, their differences. I remember he said once, it's like Freud had the spear that with a single point that of the idea of libido, and it penetrated through the veil of the unconscious. But Jung walked through that veil and opened up the whole wow. the much larger realm that was on the other side. I thought that was a very wonderful image.
Yeah,
somewhat similar to Joseph Campbell's description of Freud was sitting on a whale. He was fishing, but sitting on a whale. And it was Jung that brought us the whale. Anyway, so but it planted a seed that a sophisticated Jungian and intellectual was interested in astrology. That planted a seed, and then I started getting more signs of interest in astrology from like Rudolf Steiner's work and Jung himself.
So you were already reading a lot of Jung and Steiner.
Yes, yeah, that's right. So then I decided to go to Esalen after. I mean, I did spend a year after Harvard. I worked with heroin addicts in the inner city of Detroit, Michigan, and but then got the desire to go to graduate school so I'd have a little more autonomy. And then as I was exploring which graduate school to go to, I read an essay on an article about psychedelic therapy and the power of it, and it was focused on the work of Stan Grof. And there was a quote from Abraham Maslow about Grof's work being like the most important contribution to, I think, psychodynamic thinking or personality psychology or something like that, the most important advance since Freud, something very strong like that. And I thought, wow, here's a person that's been working with psychedelics for 20 years, and he's able to handle all these patients of wide range of syndromes and conditions, going through such powerful. I mean, anybody who's done 500 micrograms of LSD knows that we're talking about it's very powerful and potentially perilous, and it takes a lot of courage to work with it, either doing it oneself or being the therapist. And the fact that he had done this, and that he, according to this article, had created a synthesis between the mystical traditions and the Western depth psychology traditions, psychoanalysis and so forth.
And he's
I was so impressed.
He's kind of starting to say at that time that the experiences that people have, this is how I see it, the experiences that people are having are matching those of the religious and the mystical literature of all time, that there's a similarity, some kind of correlation between.
That's right. And each one enriches the knowledge of the other. In other words, it's not a one-way street. That also psychoanalysis and Jungian psychology, and he also brought in some of the other psychoanalytic theorists like Otto Rank and Wilhelm Reich, Melanie Klein, and so forth. And he said they're bringing very important insights too, that particularly for a Western audience, that would be quite important. But unlike many people who, kind of had this more general, they like Jung, or they like depth psychology, but they also are drawn towards Eastern mysticism, and they kind of are holding both together. But Grof did the synthesis. He showed in the most precise ways how the psychoanalytic and Jungian archetypal understanding found a point of interaction with the transpersonal, the spiritual, the mystical, the karmic, and so forth, the cosmic dimensions of life, of reality, of psyche, and particularly it was in the archetypal death rebirth mystery that those two come together, and that we can all sorts of things, like he was able to bring a much deeper understanding of like the Oedipus complex, or of obsessive compulsive disorder, or of various phobias, things like that, by drawing on his understanding of how early trauma, but going right back to the birth trauma and things, and prenatal as well as perinatal and right after birth, very important imprinting experiences, but the power of the birth experience and the encounter with death, that it seems to be intimately intertwined with. It brings us into we access this, we start moving beyond the limits of our ordinary reality, and we're at the extremes of human experience, birth and death, the alpha and omega. And at that point, you start tuning into the collective and the mystical and the
archetypal.
And the archetypal, right? That's right. And so he was able to map out in a way that was both very helpful for understanding the various psychopathological syndromes and disturbances of psyche, and yet was connecting it to these transpersonal and mystical realities. And he also, because of his willingness to not impose a theory on his patients as they were going through their process, he had a trust in each person's individual journey, like their own inner healing intelligence that's at work, that far transcended anything that the psychiatrist out here would necessarily be able to know. That we need to kind of honor that individuality and spontaneous healing intelligence that's at work in every person. And so by having that attitude, he was able to develop very powerful practices of psychotherapeutic healing that basically formed a bridge from healing psychopathology to spiritual self-realization in a way that went far past, say, Freud, who, you know, famously had a real sense of limitation on what how much happiness a human being could have. Like he saw
he
there was
kind of had a little bit of an interest that people actually followed his theory. That he wanted people to take it. It seemed even Jung had a problem.
Yeah, he was not fond of renegades within his own school. No, that was there, and that was, of course, the breaking point for Jung with Freud, and one can understand how it happened, though. Yeah, the more one knows about the two biographies and their interactions, you can. It's a wonder that they did come together and had such important exchange, and at the same time, you can see how almost inevitable the break would have been.
It's going to be a clash.
But somebody, you know, getting back to our earlier points about Hillman and Stan Grof, and how both of them were carrying insights from both Freud and Jung, and didn't feel you needed to negate one to affirm the other. I think you could say that when Freud and Jung had their divorce, depth psychology as a field went through a kind of inner schism that it is still dealing with to this day, though many in more recent generations are quite willing to move beyond the earlier caricatures that each was holding about the other. But I think both James's work and Stan's work represents that healing synthesis that is needed within the depth psychology world.
So when you heard all of this, did it blow you away when you first? I mean, I think maybe we got up to you went.
Yeah, maybe I should just finish that one part of the story. So yeah. I read about Grof's work. I wrote him a letter where he had been working for the National Institute of Mental Health project in LSD psychotherapy in Baltimore, Maryland, at the Psychiatric Research Center there. And so I wrote to him, and he wrote me back from Esalen, where he had just arrived as a scholar in residence. And he said, I think I might have mentioned that my plan was to be going to Esalen. He said, well, as a matter of fact, that's where I am now. So if you come to Esalen, I'd like to meet you. So I decided to go to Esalen as part of my doctoral research. And the day I arrived, which as a matter of fact was 50 years ago this season, it was like March 3rd, 1974. So 50 years ago, I walked into Esalen with all my possessions.
About to have a fateful meeting, really.
Exactly. Yeah. I had my typewriter, my guitar, and my backpack of clothes. And I didn't leave for over 10 years. I met Stan that first night.
The bigger question is, do you still have that guitar that you had from the?
No, I'm afraid I don't. It was a Fender Telecaster. Very much loved it, but I gave it to a girlfriend from the past, and so I've been more into the piano in recent years. But we did have a band at Esalen that I was the lead guitarist in. So yeah, so then that was my 10 years at Esalen, which were mind-blowing, and just many teachers were there.
But Stan Grof are very important.
That's right. And he was a scholar in residence, and he brought many people, teachers, to visit, like whether it could be anybody from, well, of course, Gregory Bateson and Joe Campbell were already coming each year there, and Gregory lived there for a while. Huston Smith many times would come to teach there, but Stan set up these month-long seminars where he would invite in people like Fritjof Capra or David Bohm or Karl Pribram or Gene Houston, and just all sorts of teachers, and shamans and mystics, Lama Govinda, Huichol shamans and people like that, all of which Stan had such a capacious openness to multiple perspectives that enriched our own. And so he really became quite an important presence there at Esalen, partly through all the people that he was bringing in, partly through his own sensibility. And you're right. I mean, he was very much the especially significant teacher for me. And then we became friends pretty early on. And then he started inviting me to lecture in his seminars. And then eventually I went on to get my doctorate, and then I started teaching as a professor, and I invited him to join me. And so then we started teaching together at CIS and at Pacifica, many, many courses over the last 40 years.
And I can see a lot of Joseph Campbell in your work, Ricky, you know, on the Great Initiation, that talk that you gave, that there's a lot of his classic mythological structure in your, you know,
that's right.
work
Yeah.
there. But is there someone from that time that, you know, maybe we don't know about as much? Like, you know, I know from Esalen, you know, there was Grof and Hillman and Campbell. But who would you say, you know, who was someone else that had a major influence, if you really look back at that time?
Huston Smith's rendering of the different Asian mystical traditions was important for me. And I also very much liked Huston as a person, loved him. I mean, he was just a very special man, gentle and insightful. Again, there were certain things he wasn't open to. But you know, for example, I had more of a engagement with evolutionary thinking, and he was more of a perennialist in terms of his ontology. You know, a lot of the most influential people were the people I lived with there at Esalen, because there was about 100 of us who lived there as a community, as a staff. And in many ways, we were taking in all the teachings, and we were the kind of laboratory of practice for these theories. And so there were a lot of very impressive people there. I remember when I first arrived, you know, as a 24-year-old kind of Harvard hippie, and suddenly in this world of people that seemed larger than life to me, reminded me of James Hillman's description of coming into Zurich, and then he would be giving, when he eventually took over the directorship of the Jung
studies.
Jungian studies there. Yeah.
Which is a parallel with you, by the way, because you became
director
the same at Esalen. Yeah.
Right, director of programs at Esalen. So James said when he sat in front of Jung for a few sessions before he decided Jung was too much as a therapist, that he needed to go to someone else who wouldn't be quite such a brilliantly
overpowering
sun that his moon would get overwhelmed. You know, he always connected that to, like, he had this sun-moon conjunction in Aries in his natal chart. That's another thing. Both James and Stan were very interested in astrology. But getting back to these individuals, so James said that when he would go to ask some of the people that he was, I don't know, like Karenyi or Adolphe Portman or Henri Corbin or
Zimmer,
and then there were old, what's that?
Zimmer, maybe.
That's right. Yeah. Those kinds of figures, he would say they were so formidable They had read so much. They were so multilingual. They'd read all the great literature. They knew all the great works of art. He said, I felt like a 95-pound weakling, you know, asking them if they could teach in his the institute that he was directing. And I think my very first experience as I'm coming in was just like all these people who they weren't necessarily intellectuals. A lot of the people that lived at Esalen were not the intellectuals, but they were the people, but they were quite courageously living at the edge. They were exploring consciousness. They were exploring new ways of being with each other. There was a certain amount of almost macho
political action 101.
That was more at Harvard. At Esalen, people were in retreat from the political world and were more, you know, and that was characteristic of the 1970s. A lot of people went back to the land. They entered communes or started things, and a lot of that came from the disappointments of the Vietnam War protests. Took so long to succeed. There was a the assassination of both Kennedys and Martin Luther King were huge traumas that kind of undercut confidence in our political future. And of course, Watergate and Nixon, et cetera. So there was a kind of retreat into the interior that happened in the 70s. And I'd say Esalen was part of that. It became more political later in the later 70s and going into the 80s when the Soviet American exchange started, when the Cold War was reaching a peak, and there was a real effort to bring together members of the people who were working at the Kremlin and people who were working in the State Department, bring them to Esalen and have them converse offline and go to the baths together, be naked in the baths and talk. I mean, the armoring's gone, and they did breath work together, and they had very powerful, there's evidence now that it played a role in when they went back to their respective positions in the governments. And I think it started moving that kind of nuclear.
It's had a huge influence, Esalen. It really has, hasn't it?
It has.
In the same way that the Eranos lectures in the Jung world had a.
That's right.
You know, Esalen was doing the same thing in the US.
That's very true. Yeah, I had that feeling when I was at Eranos, how similar in certain ways its cultural influence was, totally different realms in certain ways. One's so European and high culture. Esalen's, much more West Coast California,
at the edge of
psychedelic
thinking.
Yeah, psychedelic but et cetera, but lots of similarities too, and some figures who were lectured in both places. So yeah, they're very, very similar. The one big difference though is that there was never a community and that lived right there at Eranos. I mean, there was Olga Frobe Captain, she lived there, of course, in Casa Gabriela, and then Casa Eranos is right next to it. And then once a year they'd be bringing everybody in, but it was more of an annual, almost like festival conference gathering.
For a couple of weeks,
was
a week and a half or 2 weeks or something.
That's right. While Esalen was this ongoing kind of temple of Dionysus, so yeah.
And
but anyway,
was there a perhaps an experience you had, a psychedelic? In your book you talk about opening to the cosmos. Was there?
Yes.
Was there a singularly powerful event, would you say, or would you say you had lots of different experiences? But
well, from my very first LSD session on my 20th birthday back in Cambridge and Boston, that was very powerful. And I'd been reading Alan Watts's description of psychedelics in his book called The Joyous Cosmology. And of course, Aldous Huxley's Doors of Perception. So those were in the back of my mind, but it's one thing to read about these things. It's another thing to have the experience, and it was very powerful. That's kind of set me on the journey. And particularly after I met Stan and learned more powerful ways of entering into the experience through eye shades, headphones, interiorizing, or sometimes I would go, I mean, every other session or journey, I would do it up on the mountain above Esalen. Esalen's right on the cliffs there in Big Sur. So you have these kind of Santa Lucia mountains that are right at the edge of the Pacific Ocean. And just above Esalen are the ridges up there that generally people were not allowed to go up there. But I had special access. And so I'd go up there once a month and do my journeys up there. And there I would be totally by myself. And though my eyes would sometimes open, a lot of the times I just kept them closed. But the focus is very much interior. If you're tripping it at a party or a concert or walking around the street, you may, it tends to diminish some of the depth that you can go to, but also powerful energies and images and so forth can start flooding in anyway from the deep unconscious. And then, but because your eyes are open, the natural human tendency is to read it into what you're seeing. So let's say you're undergoing an experience of threat, let's say from, reliving some trauma or something like that, but you're walking around with your eyes open and you hear sirens in the distance. You suddenly feel like the police are coming after you, or worse, maybe it's the Nazis and the Gestapo, because you're in such a kind of non-specific open place. So learning how to use this powerful, I don't want to just say it's, I mean, sometimes Stan talks about it as a technology of the sacred, and it is that, but it's a sacrament, really, as well. And how to enter into the use of this sacrament in a way that would be most helpful for its gifts. That's something I very much learned from Stan, and that deepened my experiences quite a bit. Also, he gave me a trust in, he once said to me, the full experience of a really negative emotion like panic, fear, guilt, whatever it happens to be, the full experience of that emotion is the funeral pyre of that emotion, because it's coming up to, it can come up to consciousness and be released. Up until then, it's like jammed in the body and in the depths of the psyche, and so it needs to come to consciousness in a safe environment and then released. You need to have somebody there generally for that kind of release to happen, because it's otherwise too scary, because you can think you're dying or some vital threat is happening. So he gave me that a certain trust in the process that was very helpful for undergoing difficult experiences. So I suppose I had one very powerful experience there were just countless, that really influenced me over the decades. So I'm just singling out this one because it was quite a difficult, for several hours, really feeling like I was dying, kind of in despair, an old person dying in the, might even have been drowning, and a lot of my physical reactions were quite expressive and vivid of that state, and then suddenly this, it came in a couple of stages, but at one stage, very powerful energies that were quite scary emerged. I think it was basically, I felt like first like I was a volcano going off, not like I was seeing a volcano or that this was like a volcano. It was like I was the volcano. It was so vividly real. And to experience its the release, the volcanic release of it was explosion was just so powerful, and also like a predatory lion at the moment of reaching the prey. So I was feeling these powerful energies come over, and then it suddenly turned into birthing experiences, and it was quite scary because I felt I was going to lose. I was inside the womb, but I was losing the womb and losing the only universe I knew, and so that was extremely scary. I was trying to hold on.
It's like a death and a rebirth mystery.
Yeah,
really,
it was. Yes, and then at a certain moment, hours and hours into, there was a long dark night in this, as you may know, like you can have a couple hours or 6 hours of clock time can feel like several lifetimes of experience, because you're just kind of tuned into archetypal realities and into timeless matters, that domains that greatly stretch the fabric of experience. So suddenly, after hours and what seemed like lifetimes of quite difficult, dark night, feeling like I would never, there was no way out. I was never going to have any release. And then suddenly, it was while Beethoven's the beautiful second movement of the Eroica Symphony, the Third Symphony. The second movement is it's called Marcia Funebre. It's like a funeral march at first. It starts, it's very dignified and grieving. There's a quality of mourning, and that was going on. And then all of a sudden, at a certain moment, the music just subtly shifts into new life. You know how Beethoven can depict, almost feels like the spring emerging with the sounds of nature just coming through. You really get it in the Sixth Symphony with the pastoral symphony, but in this particular movement of the Third Symphony, which he's writing just as he's going through the despair of realizing he's going deaf, and there's this beautiful, the melody turns and the orchestration shifts, and this sense of new light and new life and joy starts emerging, and it gets bigger and bigger, and then it just makes a full declaration towards the last part of that movement. And I just wept. I mean, I could tell that Beethoven was tuned into such, he knew how suffering turned into joy. He knew from his own experience, and he was able to sort of translate that into music that was his genius. He couldn't express it in words and philosophical or religious concepts, but he conveyed it in music. And things just opened up. I just started, like golden white light started flooding into my head, and I just felt like blessed and healed, and I felt like I was a little child, and I also felt I got all sorts of insights about my life, my parents' relationship to me, and how much they love me beyond what seemed on the surface to be judgments about the path of life that I'd chosen and so forth. And I tuned into a much more primal sense of how much love was in there. It was just overwhelming. And then I also tuned into the sense of how all suffering, and this is like something that Nietzsche saw, like all pain and all suffering was hallowed by the birth labor pain, that all pain is birth pain in a certain way, and that and to trust that even the darkest places and the suffering was actually part of a larger process. That even
was it?
hell is processive.
Hordelin, or he said that at the moment of danger that salvation is also there, or something along those
Yes,
lines.
yeah, yeah. I think it was Holderlin who said that. Yeah. Jung liked to quote that.
But I can see how that's come into your work. You know, I mean, you're obviously speaking about an incredibly intense, powerful experience, but the sense of like the disenchantment of you know, modernity perhaps, and
yes,
this re-enchantment, it's the same.
Yeah, that's
same
right.
thing, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. Basically being able to recognize, I mean, then suddenly all the years that I had been focusing on, you know, the evolution of consciousness and humanity as a whole, not just my own sort of, or studying the evolution of Western thought and religion, science, philosophy, etc., and Eastern, and just suddenly seeing how we collectively were undergoing a death rebirth journey. And it gave me more of a trust in that long-term process, which you're right, it has informed me. And I'll just say one last thing about that session is that was the first session that I had scheduled. I had timed it according to what little I had understood at that point about the archetypal astrological perspective. And I'd looked at the transits for this period, and because I'd seen that Stan's sessions, my sessions, we had done some studies that suggested the relevance of the planetary transits to the birth chart, the relevance of these to understanding why different journeys or sessions, non-ordinary states of consciousness, took different forms for the same person at different times or for different people at the same time. And so I'm having this session, which was unprecedentedly opening for me, because I had way beyond anything I could have hoped for myself. But as it was happening, I just felt like this whole understanding of the archetypal cosmos was kind of downloading into me. I was beyond what I could articulate at that point, but I was getting a general intuition of our relationship to the archetypal domain in a way that was very, very transformational. And so that's one session that was memorable that I can share with you here.
I think also, you know, because I was also thinking before we started talking, you know, the Anima Mundi. I know maybe this is getting a bit technical after such a raw and powerful experience or whatever, but your Cosmos and Hillman's Anima Mundi, like what I've got from Hillman with the Anima Mundi is, you know, nature alive, the animal. It's so much from, you know, the soul in the world. But, you know, I think maybe what I get from your Cosmos when you use the word Cosmos is this death rebirth. Some of
dynamic
themes come through, yeah.
Yes, which is very strong in Jung, of course. I mean, his whole individuation process is basically built around a kind of death rebirth archetypal understanding. But you're right that there is a kind of the way I understand it now is that basically what Jung opened up to us in terms of the archetypal psyche, the archetypal unconscious, the collective unconscious, is embedded in the universe itself. It's continuous with it. We're not isolated, or it's not just a human phenomenon collectively. It's and of course Hillman was already going there too, like it's past the human. But what I've come to see is that this soul of the universe, this Anima Mundi, is of the entire universe, and it has a profound intelligence that's at work, that is capable of orchestrating as above, so below, macrocosm and microcosm. And in that
the
sense,
meaningful cosmos and the intelligent.
that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So I once had organized a big conference here in San Francisco, 1997, called "The Return of Soul to the Cosmos," which was a play on James's Anima Mundi, the return of the soul to the world. But here I was applying it to the cosmos specifically, and the whole idea of a kind of Pythagorean Platonic cosmos that is intelligently informed through and through, not just as a kind of free-floating imagination domain of subjectivity and imagination and so forth, and of images and myths and so forth, but that there's deep intelligence at work, also telos. And in this sense, we could almost say that it's something like an Animus Mundi, picking up on a suggestion of Thomas More, the Thomas More that, of course, wrote Care of the Soul, not the Renaissance Thomas More, and where there's an element of purposeful intelligence and a kind of moral spiritual telos that is unfolding in the course of history. And so in that sense, Hillman's work on the Anima Mundi was very liberating for me. And at the same time, where I went with it, in some sense, was more, as you're picking up, it was a focus on kind of like a return of soul and mind to the cosmos, with the which is another way of saying the return of spirit to the cosmos too.
It's like spirit and soul, and
Yeah.
and it's something deeply healing about an experience of the cosmos, like the way you're talking about the intelligent cosmos, the meaningful cosmos.
That's very true
of it.
The fact that we're not alienated, isolated, purposeful, conscious beings in an unconscious, purposeless, meaningless universe. And then suddenly we realize, oh, wait a minute, we're not, the meanings that are informing me are informing the cosmos. And there's a coherence, as you're saying. And more than that, we are even expressive of that cosmos. We are the cosmos in human form. And that's where our great responsibility comes in being conscious and self-reflective vessels of this cosmic soul and spirit and intelligence, and moral aspiration and spiritual aspiration. So so in some ways I feel like I've, Jung and Stan and Hillman each are so important in my understanding, as well as many other thinkers and men and women who've really influenced me. But since we're focused on depth psychology here, those three are quite crucial. And at the same time, they each has kind of contributed different aspects of
to that.
To that vision. Well, I think we probably have carried our.
I think we've gone well over, and Rick, but it's wonderful, and I really appreciate how you've shared so much, and I've also taken an enormous amount from your work, and as well as those other three that you mentioned, and in my jargon, this marriage of spirit and soul, and it takes many powerful voices to kind of give their insights in particular
Very
areas in order for us to get that. But I appreciate it very much.
Well, I'm honored that you invited me, and that you're interested in my work and your kind of immersion in it these weeks. And I think you're doing great work, and I really appreciate your skill and care as an interviewer, and yeah, it's a conversationalist. Very, very enjoyable to be with you here, and I hope that your listeners find value in our discussion today.